Alright, moving from the upper respiratory tract, we now have the lower respiratory tract. This part of the respiratory system starts at the trachea, which sits just below the vocal cords in the larynx. The trachea is a tube of tissue lined with pseudostratified epithelium that secretes mucus, and also has cilia, which helps lift that mucus up and out of the trachea. This helps us trap and excrete dirt and debris that we accidentally inhale. The trachea has these rings of cartilage that cover it. If you run your hand up and down the neck, you should be able to feel them. These C-shaped rings help protect the trachea and hold its shape, so you don't suffocate while you're trying to swallow something. At the end of the trachea, we branch out into two bronchi at the point of what's called the carina. The bronchi are these tubes with the cartilage rings, similar to the trachea, but are also surrounded by smooth muscle. These smooth muscles are stimulated by the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system and open or close depending on which system's activated. So just like the arteries and veins, the bronchi break apart into smaller and smaller tubes called bronchioles, and each time they do, there's less and less cartilage. At the very end of the bronchioles, the cartilage is stopped, and the bronchioles turn into alveoli. So that sympathetic and parasympathetic system, when it closes, those bronchioles can completely close off, and we call that bronchospasm. The alveoli are these small balloon-like tissues wrapped up in blood vessels, and these fill up with air whenever we take a breath. There are two cells inside the alveoli, or two types of cells, Type 1 alveolar cells, which make up that really thin wall that allow gas to go from the air we breathe into the blood. So like when we breathe in oxygen and it goes into the blood, and the CO2 that's in the blood jumps out, it crosses over those type 1 alveolar cells. Type 2 alveolar cells produce a substance called surfactant, which increases the surface tension of the alveoli and prevents them from collapsing completely when we exhale. So it makes sure the alveoli keeps their shape. Inside the alveoli, we also have macrophages floating around, as this is a place of the body where pathogens like to hang out and make us sick. The bronchioles and alveoli are all wrapped up in tissue called lobes, and then a couple lobes are put together to make up our two lungs. The right lung has 3 lobes and the left lobe has 2. The reason the left has less is because the heart takes up some of that space. Outside of the lungs, we have 2 linings, our visceral and parietal pleura. We talked about these way back in week 1, so see how everything's kind of coming back together? Alright, so that's it, the respiratory system. It's not a lot of organs, it's a pretty simple structure when we get through it. But let's just do one more quick overview about how the whole process works. So diaphragm contracts, or one of the accessory muscles, depending on how much we need the oxygen. And that negative pressure pulls air in through our nose and our mouth, through the oro and nasopharynx, where it's warm, humidified, and filtered. Then it travels through the pharynx, the larynx, where it passes through the glottis and the vocal cords found inside the larynx. It passes down through the trachea, traveling through your left or your right bronchi, and then into progressively smaller bronchioles until it reaches an alveoli. There, the air blows up the alveoli or fills it up, and oxygen is removed from the air we breathe, going across those type 1 alveolar cells, and it gets absorbed by the red blood cells. In the reverse, the CO2 jumps off and we exhale and blow that out. Alright, so last part. Now that we know how we breathe, what tells us to breathe? How do we know when we need to? Well, there's 3 mechanisms, and the first one's really easy, because we told it to do it. The lungs are one of those unique places where you can control it voluntarily, so with that somatic nervous system, or automatically through your autonomic nervous system. So I can make myself breathe faster, but if I am thinking about something else, my body doesn't just not breathe. It takes over that breathing responsibility. To trigger the automatic responsive breathing, our body has 2 sensors. Chemoreceptors that are in our blood measure CO2 and oxygen. And when one gets too high or too low, so when we have too much CO2 buildup or too little oxygen, it tells our brainstem to force us to breathe. We also have stretch receptors inside of our lungs, which tell us when we've taken a full breath, and that prevents us from overinflating or hurting ourselves.